I'm Richard Southern. Happy Friday. What's lurking up there in the sky in 1998 during the first space shuttle mission to the International Space Station? The first thing we try to do is to take pictures of what we see so that we have photographic evidence. NASA accidentally captured an image of a mysterious black object orbiting Earth. Other footage from the ISS has reinforced the idea that strange things are happening up in orbit. At the time, they had no idea what it was, and neither did anyone else. For a long while. The object remained unexplained, and there are still discussions about whether it's still in space. Mysterious close encounter. This object you see here was caught on camera flying past the SpaceX rocket just minutes after liftoff last week, moving silently along Earth's orbit. The only thing we know about the object is its name, the Black Knight satellite. The origin of that name is also a mystery, adding to the intrigue of this unusual object over the years. Various theories and stories have tried to explain it, but the most prominent ones seem to trace back to Nikola Tesla. In 1899, Tesla was conducting radio experiments in his lab in Colorado Springs. During one of these tests, he noticed something odd. He was picking up radio signals from space. This was in 1899, long before any satellites existed. So Tesla was left with one possibility, even though it sounded unbelievable. He was convinced that he had made contact with aliens. In a 1901 article for Collier's weekly, Tesla wrote about his experiences. The changes I noted were taking place periodically and with such a clear suggestion of number and order that they were not traceable to any cause known to me. The feeling is constantly growing on me that I had been the first to hear the greeting of one planet to another. Tesla believed he had made the first contact between Earth and beings from another planet. Some speculate that this was when the Black Knight sent its first signal, in a way similar to the plot of the three-body problem. This theory gained traction when in 1927, a civil engineer and ham radio user named Jorgen Haus began noticing strange echoes. In his radio signals while transmitting from his home in Oslo, Haus's signals would bounce back to him seconds later like an echo from Space House. Thought this could be proof of something extraterrestrial, further supporting Tesla's idea. In 2013, nearly 50 years after Haus's death, an article in Analog Science Fiction and Fact revisited the mystery of the radio signals. That's when Duncan Lunan came into the picture. Lunan suggested that the delayed echoes could have come from an object orbiting the moon, potentially one that originated 13,000 years ago. The 13,000-year figure was based on the position of the North Pole star Polaris. Lunan explained, "I tried plotting the delay times against the order in which the echoes were received, and at only the second attempt I found what looked like a star map. The signals Haus was receiving were actually something called long delay echoes. These are radio signals that come back to the sender a few seconds after the original transmission. It's kind of like when you watch a live football match on TV and on the internet, but the TV broadcast is slightly faster. This delay happens because of the time it takes for the signal to travel. In some cases, the delay is so small you wouldn't notice, but sometimes it's longer. Any delay longer than 2.7 seconds is considered an LDE, and it can be a pretty complex topic. What's important is that back then people didn't fully understand this, which made it confusing for many. In 1954, newspapers like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the San Francisco Examiner reported that the U.S. Air Force had found 2 satellites orbiting the Earth. The strange part at that time, no country had the technology to launch satellites. The Black Knight satellite was mentioned by several sources, and even though the U.S. denied it, there were credible reports from other countries confirming its existence. This object was first referenced by Nikola Tesla in 1899, then by Haus and a group of scientists in 1927, again by the U.S. Air Force in 1954, and later in 1998 by NASA. So what was this mysterious black object that seemed to be orbiting Earth for decades? By 1960, both the U.S. and the USSR were launching spacecraft into orbit, competing in the space race. But on February 11th of that year, news spread that something else was orbiting Earth. It had been picked up by a radar made by the U.S. Navy to detect enemy spy satellites instead of finding spy planes. The radar detected a dark, tumbling object that didn't belong to either the Americans or Soviets the next day. More details came out. It was orbiting about 79 degrees from the equator. Not 90 degrees as would be expected for a true polar orbit, its orbit was also very unusual visually with its highest point, apogee, 1,728 kilometers from Earth. And it's so well done that it makes people question what they remember, even thinking, did I really see that? It went from being a complete mystery to, oh, it's just a spare part. We all knew it was there, but we didn't know what it was or why it was in space. The only reasonable explanation people had at the time was that it could be of alien origin. In 1973, Duncan Lunan wrote an article for Spaceflight magazine suggesting that people studying long-delayed echoes hadn't considered the possibility that the Black Knight could have come from an alien probe. However, Lunan made it clear that his research had nothing to do with the Black Knight and wasn't connecting his theory to it. Later, Lunan admitted his method wasn't scientific and retracted his statement, even saying, "You lied. The problem isn't necessarily with what he said, but the way it was presented made people believe he might have retracted his claims due to pressure or threats." I don't know if that's true, but I do know that NASA still has a lot to answer for. As I mentioned earlier, NASA has a lot to explain, and they certainly provided a lot of details to clear up the confusion. They shared testimonies and evidence that many of these mysteries were just misunderstandings. One of the most intriguing parts of the story happened when the Discoverer satellites were launched in 1960. Dudley Sharp, Secretary of the Air Force at the time, told the press that an unknown object spotted in space was likely the second case from Discoverer 8. He speculated it was probably a twin of another object they had been tracking because it matched the size and location. This was later confirmed, and the identification even made its way into Time magazine, though it was buried on the back page. After all, boring explanations don't capture as much attention as mysterious ones. There's also an interesting side note about the Discoverer program. The CIA was involved in a related program called Corona in 1992. The details of the program were declassified, revealing that the Discoverer rockets weren't designed to carry people into space. Instead, they were intended to launch Corona spy satellites. These satellites used a polar orbit, which allowed them to fly over the entire surface of the Earth, unlike regular orbits that only cover specific latitudes. Back then, there was no way to send digital pictures back. So film cameras were used after taking pictures. The film had to be dropped back to Earth to be developed. The Corona KH-1 camera would re-enter the atmosphere, deploy a parachute, and a rescue plane would catch it midair. So even the supposed truth that NASA provided about the Black Knight satellite turned out to be a cover-up for the CIA's spy satellites. While the Discoverer program itself had its hidden agenda, the reported flights and results were accurate. Only the original purpose was misrepresented. As for Gordon Cooper's claims about what he saw during the Mercury 9 mission, it turns out that while he did report seeing UFOs, his story about seeing aliens in space was false. He clarified that the story of him seeing aliens was fabricated by UFO writers. Cooper even showed the official transcripts, including ones he wrote himself, as proof that nothing of the sort happened during his flight. The last piece of the puzzle involves the mysterious object seen in photos from Endeavour's STS-88 mission, according to NASA. The object in the famous 1998 photo was just a thermal blanket that had come loose and drifted away. The STS-88 mission was the first U.S. mission to begin construction of the International Space Station, linking the Russian Zarya module with the American Unity module. Although the crew successfully completed their tasks, there were some issues. The modules didn't line up properly at first, so when the shuttle's robotic arm released them to try again, a few things, including the thermal blanket, got loose. The object in the photo was identified as a crumpled thermal blanket, which had a silver side and a black side. If you weren't familiar with it, the shape it formed might have seemed unusual. Most people wouldn't know what it was, but luckily for the astronauts, it wasn't an alien spacecraft, it was space debris. As for Tesla, it's true that he picked up radio signals from space in 1899, but what he actually detected were pulsars, a type of star that astronomers didn't know about at the time. They weren't identified until 1968. Back then, Tesla thought he was receiving intelligent messages that couldn't be understood, but it was just the signals from a super-dense, rapidly spinning star. As for the Norwegian scientists, they did receive LDE radio reflections, but no one knows what caused them. Today we have a few ideas about what could be responsible, and most of them involve unusual phenomena happening in the Earth's ionosphere. But if an alien satellite were to enter our orbit, record our transmissions and send them back to us after an 8C delay, it could produce the same effect. There are many possible explanations for LDEs, but alien satellites aren't considered a likely cause. Still, it's possible that we haven't figured it out yet because our technology just hasn't advanced enough, kind of like Tesla's experience now regarding the name Black Knight. It turns out it's been used for several real projects. For example, the Black Knight name was attached to Britain's first space rocket, which was tested between 1958 and 1965. These tests were conducted to try out different types of re-entry vehicles, but none of the rockets ever put anything into orbit. The theories surrounding the Black Knight satellite might be influenced by multiple Black Knight projects that were completely unrelated. When you look at all the facts together, it makes you wonder, could it just be a thermal blanket? Maybe there's nothing up there, or maybe we're overthinking it. But I have one question: how could the object be discovered when neither the Soviets nor the US had the technology to send spacecraft into polar orbit? Back then, it wasn't until the 1960s that the Black Knight satellite was found again in a polar orbit. Experts say this object weighed over 10 tons, which would have made it the heaviest man-made satellite to orbit Earth at that time. But back then, we didn't have the technology to launch something that heavy into space. As for NASA's explanation of the object being a thermal blanket, this part of the story doesn't hold up in some ways. Both the shuttle and the International Space Station have always flown in semi-equatorial orbits, meaning an object in a polar orbit would have passed by incredibly fast at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. That's way too fast for the object to have been visible, and certainly too fast for so many high-quality photos to have been taken. I'm not saying NASA lied, but when you piece everything together, it does make you question things. Maybe someone in the comments has a better answer. So once again, what do you think it was? So leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.